Hello, I'm Keith Hockton, author, historian, and host of Rearview Mirror Chronicles, where we take a look back at the people and the moments that shaped our world through history. Hello. I just finished watching the 1995 BBC Pride and Prejudice. And I've seen it so many times, but I absolutely love it. And it's almost the comfort kind of show to go to. And that 1995 version it's the definitive version, I think, for a very simple reason. It actually trusts Austen. It gives her time. You know, there's 6 unhurried episodes, which allows manners, silences, misunderstandings, and social pressure to do their quiet, devastating work. You know, Andrew Davies, the writer, actually kept the wit sharp and unsentimental, while the performances felt psychologically lived in rather than decorative. You know, Colin Firth gives us Darcy, who is proud, he's awkward, he's emotionally bottled up, but suddenly he's legible as a man constrained by class and upbringing. Jennifer Ely plays Elizabeth as alert and funny, fallible, intellectually alive. You know, even the world has kind of texture. There's muddy boots, there's chilly rooms, there's awkward family dinners, something we relate to. Even now, there's money, there's marriage, there's reputation, and it all feels rather real than quaint. The series actually understands class without explaining it. You simply feel why people behave as they do, arriving at the moment when heritage, drama meet emotional realism. And I think it proved that Austen was never a cozy romance. She was sharp, she was social psychologically, and there was always that little bit of sexual tension kind of humming beneath the surface. 3 decades on, that 1995 series still feels less like an adaptation and more like Austen actually fully realized. And that led me naturally to the harder question. What led to Jane Austen's death? And what do her final years tell us about her thinking and how her thinking was changing? By 1816, Austen had already lived a life of astonishing creative discipline and quiet risk. You know, she was 40, finally successful in print, yet increasingly unwell. Something had begun to sap her strength. What exactly was wrong with her still remains uncertain. Historians and doctors have proposed possibilities, Addison's disease, lupus, and, other kind of chronic conditions, but we'll never ever really know. What we do know comes from her letters, days of relative energy followed by days of complete exhaustion, a body that would no longer reliably cooperate. The illness definitely weakened her, it narrowed her world, and slowly pushed her towards dependence. Her sister, Cassandra, stepped in, as she so often did, taking Jane to Cheltenham in search of treatment. Cheltenham, like Bath, was a thriving Regency spa town, a place where health, fashion, and hope actually converged. The treatment was simple by modern standards. Take the waters, drink them, bathe in them, submit to the idea that mineral water itself could actually restore balance to a failing body. And look, it sounds naive now, but at the time it was orthodox medicine, and for some, genuinely comforting. For Jane, I think it offered routine care and perhaps a brief illusion of recovery. I think what's remarkable is even as her health declined, her mind didn't retreat. She was finishing what we now know as Persuasion, a novel quieter, sadder than her earlier work. It's a book about second chances, about time lost and time reclaimed, written by a woman acutely aware of both. In early 1817, she began Sanditon, a sharp, unfinished experiment that turns her gaze on health tourism itself. It was brisk, ironic, and oddly very modern. And she managed 12 chapters before laying it aside in March, her strength finally giving out. These late works matter, I think, because they show us an Austen that is still evolving, less interested in youthful sparkle, more attentive to regret, endurance, and moral resistance. As her body failed, her writing deepened. And when she died the following year, her grave spoke not of novels or fame, but of her virtues, her patience, and of course her faith. The irony is unmistakable. The woman whose quiet observation reshaped literature was remembered first as a good daughter, a good sister, and a good Christian. Yet her legacy refused to stay quiet. From that muddy, emotionally precise world of Pride and Prejudice to the unfinished sharpness of Sanditon, Austen actually remains uncannily alive. Her final days didn't diminish her vision, they sharpened it. And perhaps that's why, when we watch her stories unfold on screen, they still feel less like period drama and more like people that we recognize, breathing, hesitating, desiring, just like us. I think there's something unbearably poignant about this final stretch of Jane Austen's life. She's clearly struggling physically, she's weakened, exhausted, aware that something is deeply wrong, and yet her mind won't stop working. Ideas are still buzzing, characters are still knocking. And even as her health collapses, she keeps writing, she keeps imagining, she keeps shaping sentences. She puts Sanditon down in March 1817, and by July, she is dead. I think it's heartbreaking to think about what was lost, actually. Austen was astonishingly fast. Even allowing for the fact that several novels had earlier beginnings, she was effectively producing a finished work every year. And remember, this is handwritten work. And I think if she had lived as long as her sister Cassandra into the 1840s, I don't think we'd be talking about one extra novel. I think we'd be talking about a completely different second act for Austen. More experiments, more risks, perhaps even another mystery, another turn we never get to see. As her condition worsened, Cassandra did what she always did. She acted. Jane was the first seen by an apothecary in Alton, the nearest town to Chawton, but there was little that he could offer. So Winchester was then chosen. It was close enough to manage the journey, and crucially, it was where a respected surgeon, Dr. Lyford, was based. This was not a grand medical pilgrimage. It was a practical decision made under pressure by a sister who knew time was running out. In Winchester, Jane grew steadily weaker. And we can piece this together largely from her letters, fragments of courage written in a failing hand. One of them, written from College Street, where she lodged, is, I think, quietly very devastating. She tells her family, "I have had better days since you were here." That's it. I mean, that sounds hopeful. It sounds brave. And we now know that it was actually written just weeks before her death. She arrived in Winchester at the end of May in 1817. She died 6 or 7 weeks later. So that small note of improvement sits almost unbearably close to the end. She was just 41 years old when she died. Jane Austen died in July 1817, still in Winchester, still thinking, still creating, still believing, at least some of the time, that she might recover. And there is something deeply moving about that refusal to surrender, about a woman whose body was failing, but whose imagination never did. The tragedy, I don't think, is that she died young. It's that she died with so much pressing to be written. There is, of course, much more to explore around Jane Austen's death. Entire theories spiral out from it, some sober, some speculative, even the occasional conspiracy. We simply don't have time to wander down all those paths today. So by July 1817, the end had come. Jane Austen died quietly in Winchester, and she was buried in Winchester Cathedral. And here again, the reality is more restrained, more intimate than modern fame might lead us to expect. Her funeral was actually very small. It took place early in the morning on the 24th of July, about a week after her death. Custom dictated that women did not attend funerals, so the service was witnessed by just 4 people. 3 of her brothers, Edward, Henry, and Frank, and her nephew, James Edward Austen Lee. That was it. No crowds, no literary admirers, no sense that English literature had just lost one of its defining voices. Cassandra, her closest companion, her confidant, her emotional anchor, wasn't allowed to attend. She would have watched the procession standing apart. And I suppose it's impossible not to wonder what that moment felt like for her, whether she had already said her real goodbye in those final weeks, whether exclusion from the ceremony mattered less than having been there at the very end. You know, the rules of the time feel brutally indifferent to the depth of that sisterly bond. And I think what strikes me now is how modest it all was. You know, to imagine a funeral of 4 people for someone whose novels would go on to shape the emotional grammar of modern fiction, it almost feels surreal. But at the time, Jane Austen was not a public figure. Her books were known, but she herself remained largely anonymous. She died in the eyes of the world as a private woman. Even her grave reflects that. The stone set into the floor of Winchester Cathedral doesn't mention that she was a novelist at all. It praises her character, her gentleness, her Christian faith, but says nothing of Pride and Prejudice, nothing of Emma, nothing of the sharp intelligence that transformed the English novel. To modern readers, I think that omission stings a bit. It feels a little bit like an injustice. Yet, context matters. It wasn't customary to list literary achievement on gravestones, you know, even for writers who enjoyed far more fame in their lifetimes than Jane ever did. This was not erasure so much as convention. And in time, a correction of sorts arrived. A brass plaque was later installed on the cathedral wall, funded following the publication of James Edward Austen Leigh's memoir in the late 1860s. And I think its opening line is quietly perfect. Jane Austen, known to many by her writing. Only then does the world finally name what she was. And there's something oddly fitting about that delay, you know. Austen herself never chased celebrity. Her reputation grew after her death slowly, steadily, almost against her will. She ends her life remembered first as a good woman, a beloved sister, and a private soul. And it's only later, unmistakably, as one of the greatest writers who ever lived. In her will, she leaves almost everything to Cassandra. As she had lived, so she ended. Her world narrowed to the people she loved most. And from that small, quiet ending, a vast literary afterlife unfolded. I touched on it on another episode that I did on Austen, but I think it's worth lingering here because the relationship between Jane Austen and her sister Cassandra Austen really is the emotional spine of her life. You know, from birth to death, they're actually inseparable. They share rooms, routines, confidences, jokes, disappointments. And when Jane's life is ending, Cassandra is there. Not intermittently, not at a distance, but constantly, daily, hourly. She's present in those final weeks, in those final days, right to the end. After Jane's death, Cassandra writes a letter to one of their nieces that I think is actually quietly devastating. She describes Jane as sunshine, as the soother of every sorrow. And when you stop and think about what that means in retrospect, you know, how young Jane was when she died, how much life Cassandra then had to live without her, it's actually hard not to feel the full weight of that loss. You know, these two women had been each other's confidants for an entire lifetime. To lose that at 41 must have been shattering. And this is where things become more complicated. In recent years, and most recently dramatized in Miss Austen, you know, based on the novel by Gil Hornby, attention has actually turned to what Cassandra did after Jane's death, the long suspected and now widely accepted truth that Cassandra destroyed a significant number of Jane's letters. And for a long time, this was actually seen almost instinctively as an act of love. Sister protecting a sister. But the series Miss Austen asks us to look again, not cynically, but seriously at Cassandra's motivations and at the consequences. Because whether we like it or not, that decision profoundly shaped how we understand Jane Austen today. 160 letters survive. And that actually sounds like a lot until you remember that Jane wrote constantly for decades. And the real number must have been in the thousands. What we have is a mere fragment, and the fragment we have is, by definition, curated. Cassandra didn't just preserve letters, she selected them, and in doing so, she actually shaped the raw material from which all later interpretations of Jane's private life would be built. And I think what's striking is that the surviving letters are not bland. Some are sharp, some are funny, some are observant, some are actually unkind. There is at least one where Jane makes a rather cruel joke about a neighbor's miscarriage, a remark that actually lands badly to our modern ears. But of course, people say unkind things. People make jokes they would never want preserved forever. None of us would want our worst WhatsApp messages or emails or offhand remarks fossilized for public consumption 2 centuries later. And that, I think, is perhaps the point. Jane Austen was a private person, a published writer, yes, but not a public one in the modern sense. She guarded her anonymity. She didn't want her name plastered everywhere. And I think it's entirely plausible that Cassandra, who knew her better than anyone alive, understood that Jane would not have wanted her private thoughts, her irritations, her flirtations, and her vulnerabilities laid bare for posterity. And if you see it that way, the burning of the letters, it's not censorship, but guardianship, a final act of sister loyalty. The equivalent of deleting someone's private messages rather than handing them to complete strangers. And yet, it leaves us with unavoidable gaps. We know there were moments of romantic intensity. Tom Lefroy still flickers through the surviving correspondence. We know Jane had strong opinions, strong dislikes, a sharp tongue when she felt like using it. So the question lingers, what was removed? What was deemed too intimate, too revealing, too painful, or too human to survive? Cassandra never told us. She never explained herself. And so we are left with a Jane Austen shaped not by her novels, but by her sister's silence. It's tempting to see that as a loss, I know, but it may also be a gift. Jane Austen, the writer, survives in full brilliance. Jane Austen, the private individual, remains partially veiled, protected even now by the person who loved her the most. And perhaps that too is also part of her legacy. And this is exactly it. And it's one of the great unresolved mysteries for anyone who gets seriously interested in Jane Austen. What was burned? What was withheld? What never made it across time? Did she really meet someone at the seaside? What did she truly feel about Harris Bigwither? What were her private doubts about her writing, her ambitions, her frustrations? We know there must have been moments of far greater emotional exposure than the fragments that we were left with. And yet what survived feels, if not slightly sanitized, then at least gently laundered. That in itself has consequences. It makes it easy, I think too easy, to slide into the idea of Jane Austen as the pure, bloodless, sexless writer, the safe single woman, the maiden Aunt Jane, surrounded by nieces and nephews, more than 25 of them, I have to add, absorbed into family life, witty but contained. That image sticks partially because of the letters, or rather because of the absence of so many of them. We also forget how inaccessible those letters were for most of the 19th century. Today we can actually buy a single edited volume and read them straight through, almost like a novel. But that was not how Austen was encountered for decades after her death. For most readers, the first glimpse of Jane Austen the person came through as something else entirely, the biographical notice published with Persuasion and Northanger Abbey. And that notice is generally attributed to her brother Henry Austen. And it is in many ways, it's very lovely. It paints Jane as gentle and modest, affectionate, quietly gifted. There are moments where I think it also edges towards the sentimental, but it's still recognizably human. And of course, the problems come later. Because when her nephew, James Edward Austen Leigh, publicizes his memoir in the late Victorian period, the tone actually shifts. Jane becomes increasingly saintly, almost godly, a model of domestic virtue, deeply religious, morally exemplary, and I think also faintly prim. And while she may have been religious and good and kind, Prim never really sat comfortably with the voice that I heard in her novels, or even in the sharper surviving letters. The Victorian image hardened. It travelled forward into the early 20th century. And once it's established, it's remarkably hard to dislodge. Jane Austen, the ironist, the flirt, the acute observer of desire and disappointment, is softened into Jane Austen, the safe national treasure. So what was James Edward Austen Lee doing? Was there a commercial instinct there, polishing her reputation so the books would sell better? Or was this simply his love for Jane? And let's just take a quick break, and we'll be back in a second with part 2. Autonomous is your one-stop shop for your Malaysia My Second Home visa. But they are much, much more than that. When you sign up with Autonomous, you become part of a larger community, a community that actually cares about you and your family in Malaysia. And that's important when you move to a new home. For more information, go talk to TG or WhatsApp him on +60 12 49 37 270 or visit their website penangmyhome.com. And we're back. Personally, I think it was most likely love. He was very close to her. He was present at her funeral, and by the time he writes the memoir, more than 50 years have passed since her death. Interest in Austen is growing, but people still know very little about her. He even says, in effect, readers want to know the author behind the books. This is the moment to tell them. But it's also a very different moment culturally. Victorian values are not Regency values. Inevitably, he interprets her through his own time. Just as modern adaptations tell us as much about the era making them as about Austen herself, so this memoir tells us as much about Victorian ideals as about Jane. And I think there's one more crucial turning point. After Jane's death, Northanger Abbey and Persuasion are published together at the end of 1817. For the first time, they appear under her real name. And it says, by the author of Pride and Prejudice suddenly becomes by Jane Austen. That matters. It changes how the books are read. It gives her a public identity at last. But it also fixes that identity at a moment when she is no longer alive to complicate it. You know, the Jane Austen the world meets then is mediated by siblings, by nephews, by editors, by the values of those left behind. And so what we actually inherit is a paradox, a writer of extraordinary psychological depth whose own inner life remains tantalizingly out of reach. And perhaps that's fitting, you know. Austen understood better than most that what people show the world is rarely the whole truth. And maybe in the end, the greatest mystery she leaves us is not what she hid, but how much she actually revealed in fiction instead. And I think this is a really important point to land on as we close this circle around Austen. Those novels were always understood to be written by a woman. That was never the mystery. So putting Jane Austen on the title page in 1817 doesn't suddenly reframe them ideologically. What it does is something subtler and more powerful. It gives readers permission to imagine a person behind the voice. And Henry Austen's biographical notice plays a crucial role in reshaping that imagination. One of the most striking things that Henry does in that notice is insist on how funny she was. He writes memorably that her writing was never heard to such advantage as when she read it aloud herself, because she possessed all the gifts of a comic muse. You know, that line matters enormously. Modern readers often miss just how comic Austen actually is, because comedy ages badly if you lose the context. On the page alone, without tone, without timing or shared reference, points, irony can all flatten. And that's why adaptations are so powerful, because they restore the rhythm, the expression, and the social awkwardness, and they let the jokes land again. And Henry is quietly pushing back against a narrowing of her reputation, even as it forms. He's saying, don't make mistakes for polite romance. This woman was sharp, she was observant, she was funny in a way that depended on voice, timing, and social knowledge. The problem is genre. People going in and out of others' houses is still one of the laziest dismissals of Austen, but what looks like small social movement is actually a satire under a microscope. Visiting is not neutral. Who visits whom, how often, with what formality, and under whose invitation is the entire political economy of Regency England in miniature, and she nails it. This is also where I think Helena Kelly's book, Jane Austen, The Secret Radical, is also really useful. In the introduction, she makes the bracing point that we often read novels that are not actually there. We read Austen through modern assumptions and we miss references that would have been instantly legible to her original audience. And once you recover what they knew, whole layers kind of snap into focus. Take Northanger Abbey as an example. Modern readers often see it as a light coming-of-age story about an impressionable young woman overindulging in Gothic fantasies, which it is, partly. But for Austen's contemporaries, it was also a razor-sharp parody of a very specific literary craze. The Gothic novels, Catherine Morland devours, were everywhere, melodramatic, sensational, morally dubious. Austen's audience would have recognized the tropes immediately. They would have absolutely laughed, not just at Catherine, but at the publishing industry that produced those books in bulk. Or take Sense and Sensibility. The contrast between sense and sensibility is not just emotional temperament. It actually maps onto a real cultural debate at the time about reason versus excessive feeling, one tied up with the anxieties about revolution, political instability, and the social order after the French Revolution. Eleanor's restraint and Marianne's emotional excess would have resonated as ideological positions, not just as personality traits. Even something as apparently bland as militia presence in Pride and Prejudice carries weight. Officers were not just flirtatious young men in uniform. They were actually symbols of national anxiety, defense, masculinity, and of course, moral risk. Lydia's elopement with Wickham, it's not merely a family embarrassment. To Austen's readers, it brushes up against the fears about disorder, sexual license, and of course, the fragility of social reputation. And then there is money. Modern readers often glide past income figures. Austen's readers wouldn't. When she tells you what someone earns per year, she's actually telling you exactly where they sit in the social hierarchy, who they can marry, where they can live, and how much power they have. Those numbers in her books weren't decorative. They were actually diagnostic. So yeah, there is a gulf of 200 years between us and Austen's first readers. And I think that's the gulf that really matters. We bring our own concerns to her work, which is why she remains endlessly adaptable and, of course, popular. But something is lost when we forget how alert, how satirical, how politically aware she actually was. Henry Austen's biographical notice, small as it is, tries to nudge readers in the right direction. This isn't just romance. This is comedy. This is intelligence. This is someone who knew exactly what she was doing. And perhaps that's why Austen endures, because every generation reads her slightly differently. But the more we recover what her own audience saw, the more astonishing I think she becomes. And I think it also shows how literate and how playful Austen was within her own literary world. Pride and Prejudice doesn't just sound good, it rings a bell. Contemporary readers would have recognized the phrase immediately from the work of Frances Burney, one of the more famous novelists of the late 18th century. And Burney was a literary celebrity in her day. Jane Austen admired her deeply, studied her very carefully, and positioned herself in dialogue that was aligned with her thinking. And that context mattered. When Austen's father first wrote to the publishers about first impressions, he didn't summarize the plot. He described the manuscript by comparison, saying it was about the length of one of Burney's novels. And I think that tells you everything. Austen was being pitched not as a curiosity, but as part of an established, respected female literary tradition. And I think also by later choosing Pride and Prejudice as the title, Austen was kind of winking at readers who knew Burney's work well enough so that they could actually catch the echo. And I think that's lost on modern readers. They miss that point. You know, Burney has slipped from the mainstream, but Austen's contemporaries would have smiled at the reference and understood that this was a novel written by someone who knew exactly where she sat in the literary conversation. And I think that makes it even more striking that Austen herself seems never to have moved in the famous literary circles of her day. You know, she almost certainly never met Lord Byron, though she clearly read him and she mentions him in Persuasion. Her publisher, John Murray, published both Austen and Byron, and even sent a copy of Emma to Byron as a gift. The connection certainly exists, but I don't think the meeting ever did, or at least there's no record of one taking place. The same, I think, is true of Walter Scott. He reviewed her work admiringly. He understood what she was doing, yet they never met. Austen sits slightly apart, I think, from the romantic coteries. She's actually not part of a self-conscious literary movement. She doesn't circulate in salons or late-night clubs. Her writing life remains domestic, rooted in family, neighbors, and a very small circle of intellectually alert friends like Madame Lefroy. Brilliant, engaged, but not famous in the way the romantic poets were becoming. That then had me thinking, well, how was she received in the Victorian era? I think the answer is, at first, steadily rather than explosively. You know, her novels remained in print. They were certainly respected, but they were increasingly read through a Victorian moral lens. You know, the sharper edges were softened. Irony, I think, also became gentility. Satire became sweetness. And as we discussed earlier, you know, the memoir by James Edward Austen Lee actually played a very large role there. You know, his portrait of his aunt, affectionate and sincere, nonetheless filtered her through Victorian values. And she becomes exemplary, domestic, mild, almost saintly. And of course, that image would have suited the age. You know, Victorians liked Austen because she seemed safe. Her novels could be presented as morally improving, socially stabilizing, and I suppose also reassuringly English. She was taught as a model of good sense, of good manners, and certainly good womanhood. However, the comedy remained, but I think the bite was dulled. So the political and the social tensions her contemporaries would have felt very much receded into the background. And yet, admiration grew. New editions appeared, illuminated versions flourished. She became part of the literary furniture of the nation. And of course, by the late 19th century, she was firmly canonized, though not always fully understood. And I think that irony is actually delicious. You know, the woman who mocked social pretension, you know, marriage markets, inherited privilege, moral hypocrisy, was embraced actually as a symbol of order and propriety. But the novels themselves never actually changed. And over time, I think readers began to hear the sharper notes again. And that's why Austen's reputation doesn't sit still. Each era reads her completely differently. The Victorians made her respectable. The 20th century rediscovered her irony. The 21st century uncovers her wit, her anger, her intelligence, and I think in her immense joy in observation. And perhaps that's the final proof of her greatness. She wasn't just part of her own literary moment. She was durable enough to survive being misunderstood for a century and still emerge smiling with all of that incredible mischief intact. By comparison, the Bronte sisters wrote with emotional extremity. There was a storm in them, a madness. There were wild landscapes. There were tortured interiors. And by all accounts, they were not admirers of Austen. Charlotte Bronte famously found her too restrained, too limited, too polite. And from that perspective, you can see why. Austen doesn't rage on the page like the Brontes. You know, she doesn't give you the thunder and the lightning, but she gives you drawing rooms and dinner invitations and the conversations that went with them. Then you have Charles Dickens, whose novels teem with the urban poor, child labor, social injustice made loud and very unmistakable. Austen gives us almost none of that directly. Her world is narrow by design, and for Victorian readers, that narrowness, I think, looks like safety. You then add that to the publication of James Edward Austen Leigh's memoir, which gently but decisively framed her as prim and proper, morally exemplary, and you get the Austen who becomes acceptable, even ideal Victorian reading. Safe homework, improving literature, something you can actually give to a young person without fear of moral contamination. And that image stuck. It didn't repel readers, it reassured them, but it also flattened her. Which is why it's so striking that during the First World War, soldiers suffering from shell shock were actually given Austen to read. Her novels were considered calming, orderly, soothing. Even Winston Churchill famously reread Austen for comfort, remarking that there was no trouble or strife there. There were no words to that effect that would cause effect. And yet, of course, the irony is extraordinary. Interestingly, Jane Austen lived almost her entire life during wartime. She was actually born very close to the American Revolutionary period. She lived through the long, long shadow of the French Revolution, and she wrote during the Napoleonic Wars. Two of her brothers were naval officers, deeply involved in Britain's war effort. Henry spent time in the militia. War was certainly not abstract to her. I think it was very intimate. I think it shaped family life, income, risk, absence, and of course, fear. The difference is that she doesn't foreground it. She kind of lets it hum in the background. Militia officers appear, naval careers matter, fortunes rise and fall through imperial systems. The world is actually full of conflict in her novels. It's there. It's just not center stage. And because modern readers and Victorian readers before them expect war to announce itself loudly, I think we often conclude that Austen is disengaged from it, but she's not. She's simply more subtle. Subtlety is the key word. Her wit is subtle. Her social criticisms are subtle. Her engagement with the wider world, I think, is also subtle. And of course, subtlety is easily mistaken for absence. Let's take Mansfield Park, one of my favorites, and slavery. Austen never delivers a speech. She never moralizes openly. But within the first pages, we're actually told that the Bertram wealth comes from an estate in Antigua. Every contemporary reader would have understood exactly what that meant. Sugar, enslaved labor, imperial exploitation. That knowledge for Austen would have sat silently beneath the narrative. We also know that Austen admired the abolitionist poet William Cowper. We know her brothers had connections that aligned with abolitionist sympathies. We also know that the name Mansfield itself actually echoes Lord Mansfield's historic legal rulings that helped destabilize slavery's legal foundations in Britain. Although she never says it, we can assume that's why she used the name. This isn't accidental. It's just her being quiet. Modern scholars like Deirdre LaFay and Devoni Louza have done, I think, vital work piecing these things together precisely because Austen refuses to spell them out. The references are so discreet that we actually struggle to decode them without serious historical reconstruction. And of course, that brings us to the tantalizing question that I raised at the beginning of this podcast. If she had lived longer, would that subtlety have shifted? Would confidence have led her to be more overt? Would her later novels have widened their lens further? We already see signs of this in Persuasion with its stronger moral seriousness, and also in the unfinished Sanditon, where she turns a sharper eye on modernity, health fads, speculation, and social performance. Miss Lamb's brief appearance, described pointedly as a wealthy heiress, hints at race, also, I think, empire, and inheritance without elaboration. Again, Austen plants the seed, and she trusts the reader to understand. So when we think about her legacy, I don't think it's that she just endured. It's that she was repeatedly misunderstood, I think also repeatedly domesticated and softened, and even though all of that, she still survived. You know, the Victorians made her safe. The 20th century, I think, found her comforting, and the 21st century is rediscovering her as sharp, ironic, politically aware, and quietly radical. And I think that's also why she remains such a companionable writer. You know, you can return to her for comfort because it's like visiting an old friend. But I think also, if you look a little bit harder, if you listen more closely, she keeps revealing new things. Not because she changed, but because we're finally learning how to read what she was writing. And that, I think, in the end, may be her greatest legacy. This episode of Rearview Mirror Chronicles is brought to you by Entrepot Publishing, the home of independent storytelling. We publish books that celebrate history, art, and the extraordinary people who make life fascinating. You can find our titles and maybe your next great read at entrepotpublishing.com. Thanks for listening in, folks. Bye for now.